Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Okay, we're right on time, it looks like. Thank you so much, Shezad, for joining.
My,
I'll, um, I'll get started now with just a little intro, just for those who are here and coming in now. We'll give them a few minutes to trickle in. But for those who don't know who I am, I'm Chelsea Pettit, Head of Arts at the Bagri Foundation, and this is the first in our Open Up series. Which is really just a series looking to get to know some artists who are working everywhere in the world, really, who all come from across Asia or Asian diaspora. And I'm really thrilled to have Shezad as the first artist to join the series. And I hope that it will be a more enlightening and open conversation to really get to know what's important to you, Shezad, today. Because it feels like we're living in a really important moment in history, and it feels fitting to talk sort of beyond just your work, because your work absolutely touches upon some of the most important things that are happening right now too, but also to dig deeper to understand a bit more about what drives you. So a quick bio for those who don't know your work, and yeah, I'm sure most people who are joining do, but just in case, those who don't know Shazad's work, it's very cross-disciplinary, encompasses film, performance, painting, neon, sculpture, virtual reality, and even choreography. And he asks key questions around narrative, history, embodiment, and he's very interested in the esoteric or the otherness, the environment, architectures, both material and virtual, and interweaves stories and realities and symbolism through really complex multi-layered artworks. So the interview shouldn't last more than about 30, 45 minutes, depending how long Shezad, you and I end up talking, but I'll cut us off at some point. We'll start with a short chat about your daily routine, how it's changed over the past few months, and then discuss a bit more about the probing questions, as I'm calling them, which I think Shezad called lifestyle magazine questions, but something to get to know you a little bit more. Yeah, and then at the end, we'll hopefully have some more time for questions and comments. So let's get started.
sure.
Shezad, thanks again. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've been working in these past few months in your studio, and how that process has been for you during lockdown?
Oof. It's been I think it's probably been very strange and weird and perverse for everyone the last couple of months. I guess in a way to see, a climate crisis, a health crisis, and then obviously a racial crisis erupt one after the other. It just does feel like a lot of things I've been talking about in my work were suddenly kind of coming to the forefront. And I guess, God, how do you weather a sort of storm that needs to come in some way? There's a lot of kind of key interlinking issues that I think, and interdisciplinary issues that I think we need to address at the moment. Not being able to leave a small circumference between my home and my studio, which is mercifully a 10-minute walk away. It's given a much needed space for sort of reflection and to kind of work on some stuff that I was already working on, and then also try and reflect on real-time events as they've been kind of succeeding one another.
Yeah, and those events obviously every day is kind of a new discussion, and it seems like there's a work of yours, Leviathan, which you've put on online over the past few weeks, and every week there's a new episode kind of being screened. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that piece, because it does feel even more kind of relevant to today.
Yeah, I mean, Leviathan started out already about 5 years ago as an odyssey that I embarked on, you know, uh, and early in the sort of process of the project, it looks at the thinking, forces, the climate crisis, the refugee crisis, and the mental health, which now seem really real and apparent to people. Funny to sort of have been sort of talking about subjects and explaining till I was blue in the face about how they were, intimately and deeply interconnected structurally, and particularly in the way they were going to affect, yet again, the global South disproportionately in a way. So it's almost like the system is stacked,
Mm-hmm.
so the house always wins. and how do we unpick those kind of webs of power, deceit, extraction, and look at how they are not just systemic factors, but they affect people intimately
Hmm.
in their day to day. And it's funny how, I guess, for the first time in the Western world, rather than looking at something on our TV screens as happening very far away, it's happening, and is right amongst us. It's quite a useful wake up call, I think, in so many ways. And I'm not surprised that other uh, dark aspects of our psyche that I guess in the West brushing under the carpet are home to roost.
Hmm.
I was particularly horrified at counter protesters in Hertfordshire in the UK
Hmm.
telling Black Lives Matter protesters to go back to Africa. I mean, that just sort of it kind of woefully contradicts politicians' narratives that around this ridiculous sort of British Empire exceptionalism, that somehow the British Empire was was not as bad as everyone else, as if there's a spectrum of not badness,
Hmm.
that is
Hmm.
somehow morally to be aspired to. I mean, it's just the syntactical breakdowns around a lot of that sort of communication is a kind of would be funny if they weren't so tragic.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think to give some context to your Leviathan project itself, it's for those who haven't seen it all, it's looking at the future 20 to 50. The first three episodes I've seen are 20 to 50 years in future. It's quite dark and quite well, we call it post-apocalyptic, which we kind of immediately think is quite dark, but there's the through the various eyes of individuals, there's a kind of exploration of a lack of empathy for others, whether that's animals, which of course references climate change, animal rights, but also a lack of empathy for other humans a bit that comes through in that. And I just wondered, I guess where that kind of is coming from, or maybe you're changing your view and thinking there's a more hopeful future now.
I mean, it's interesting because, in a way, I always planned the first, because Leviathan, one of its main strands is an intense cycle of 10 films that chart this journey through the world 20 to 50 years from now, imagined future, which, in the traditions of the best sort of speculative and science fiction, is always actually about the present. So it's a way to kind of critique the present, but also look at what we're heading, what we're creating for ourselves. What sort of world are we creating for ourselves to live in? And you know, having kids, obviously, it's a key question uppermost in my mind. But what's been strange for me is that I've made, as a response to having children, I've made some of the darkest work I've ever made.
Oh.
That's an odd one for me, and it's one I'm still processing. But it felt like somehow there was a sort of honesty needed with this project, or an uncensored, um, I guess, articulation. And it wasn't just an articulation from my head, because with this project I've been working with a number of people working on the front line of the climate crisis, of the refugee crisis, and you realize it's bad. You can't tidy this stuff up and make it palatable for family viewing.
Mm.
And I think, one of the things I felt myself sort of compelled to fight back against with this project was the increasing recent tendency for institutions, to create family-friendly material to justify their funding. And what we've been seeing is an increasing kind of, creeping self-censorship by institutions, by artists. And I think, um,
Has that changed the way you're approaching the last? Because you've done what, 5 episodes now?
done the first five, which were always intended as the sort of almost the sort of destructive, Kali arc of the project.
Okay.
So um, it's the first 5 episodes represented disintegration, a breakdown, a fragmentation that
Mm.
actually I was seeing all around me. So in a way, it's not that futurist. It's very much like it's 1, 2, 3. Here we are. But yeah, I mean, getting through number 5 and thinking, oh God, I'm depressing myself. There needs to be something, and also that it's great to critique, but what can I wanted to kind of think about what did I have that was more constructive to offer, and so 6 to 10. I'm sort of loosely working on episode 6 and under the sort of theme of methodologies for surviving the future. So
Mm-hmm.
how do we reclaim agency, you know, in a world gone mad? And you know,
Yeah.
how do we recover a degree of dignity in the world we currently find ourselves in? You know, and that's weirdly become, you know, more urgent in with everything that's been coming out of the woodwork recently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting because you know, episodes 6 and 7 are also delayed because of the pandemic. So
The irony, the irony. But
there's an irony, but there were lines like in my working script for episode 6. There was a whole thing about pandemics, and this is before Corona.
yeah.
Obviously, it will now look like it's me bouncing off Corona, but I think, you know, one of the things I was thinking about is this idea of symbiosis between us and the planet. You know,
Mm.
because we're so sort of worried about having to kind of, you know, one of the key worries that, you know, scientific and medical experts are coming out with is this idea that we might have to learn to live with the virus.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously we live with any number of viral pathogens and bacteria. But
Mm-hmm.
the key question I've been reflecting on since very early in this project is if you flip that round, all these things are having to live with us.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
What, you know, whose agency are we talking about? You know, is there a viral agency, and you know, bags of meat are just the kind of hosts?
It's interesting because I suppose, is that not a little bit of the idea of the Anthropocene, where it's the humans that are the pathogen to the planet, right? And everything else is kind of infiltrating us to fight back in a way. And I think anyone who's done their research would actually have seen that pandemics were already on their way. We had sort of small ones previously. So it's like you've been doing this research for so long now, over a decade. I think you said that of course you're going to be mentioning pandemics and you know, the breakdown of society and its reaction to that kind of impact on humans through the work that you're doing already. But I suppose what's interesting is the research you're doing now seems to be looking maybe at the rebuilding of some of those lost. Well, you mentioned coral rebuilding and things. So the Earth that can be rebuilt, is that the kind of direction you're looking at in terms
I
of?
think it's yes. I mean, you know, in terms of a sort of somewhere between a language of feeling and a language of research, it's somewhere. You know, it's definitely it's not just one isolated case, such as with you know, hybridizing coral to make them more resistant. I think it's thinking about that through and across species.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is you know, what happens to us as a species if we are viral? You know, if we are the virus, if what is the radical future where we can reimagine hybridity and being, you know, in a post pandemic landscape, you know, in a post capital landscape? I think there's a lot of key questions that are being asked of us at the present moment. And for me, it's always this thing: are we asking the questions, or are they being asked of us? And obviously, generally, they're being asked of us. You know, and it's again how to dethrone the you know, Anthropocene, or the
Mm-hmm.
you know, the need to anthropomorphize everything
Yeah.
from the ground up.
To fit around us, I suppose, as well. So that kind of leads to, well, you said Leviathan 6 and 7 are somewhat delayed at the moment.
Yeah.
So I suppose we'll keep our eyes peeled for that, and TBC. But there were some other impacts on your practice in the past few weeks that have come to the fore. I suppose one being the Folkestone Triennial, which you were going to take part in September, has been delayed. But then you also are taking part in a group show at the Veals in Brussels this September, right? So I
Which
wondered if you could,
all
yeah,
going ahead, you know, at the
all
moment, all going ahead as far as we know.
yeah. So could you talk? Is there anything you can reveal about those works and whether you've, you know, changed any of your perspectives on those given the circumstances?
Well, I could sort of cheekily do a quick reveal of the studio behind me because I know you were saying that'd be possible. So why
Yeah,
don't I do that? It's sometimes nice to start with a visual.
great.
Let me just flip you around, everyone. Oh, that's my printer.
Brilliant. We've decided, everyone, that Shezad shouldn't go wandering around the studio too much because his Wi-Fi drops. So we're just going to keep it to a small area, but it's beautiful. Thank you.
So these are some of the new works that are on the go for Veals. This is very much on the go, very much starting. And then there's some more works moving around the studio there. And then smuggled around the studio. Actually, there's some things that you at Bagri have very kindly supported previously. So that's one of the 1980s video game Pakistan tapestries from encroachments that you guys helped support at Sharjah. And then these are a couple of encroachments-related paintings from NAE in Nottingham, which luckily happened and finished, and the work was returned just before lockdown. So there's this interesting thing about even some of my work's still out there in lockdown, which is kind of, it's quite funny when, we were just talking about censorship and other things. It's funny what is the work? I've been asking a lot, as somebody who works between writing, painting, filmmaking, and as you said, there's this whole Leviathan broadcast season. For anyone who hasn't supported yet on Art Review or Modern Form, you can see, already missed the first 3 episodes. I think episode 4 goes live tomorrow. So episode 3 you can catch today. Episode 4 is live for a week.
Episode 3. Arturo, I think, is on today. Yeah, it's still up there. So Modern Form's website or Art Review website, both have them on their homepage. Yeah,
exactly. So you can catch some of those episodes, and it's been really interesting to release those, and as a kind of alternative streaming within lockdown, and just connect with people and not make it so difficult for people to kind of access the work. But also, sorry, going back to what is the work? So is it a physical painting? Is it writing? How do you disseminate and disperse, work across multiple media platforms, which has always been interesting for me. I've always been obsessive about artist books because of the way they can become an exhibition, a hardbound exhibition or a cloth-bound exhibition. And that becomes another form of exhibition making. So, a lot has been said recently about, oh my God, what will become of the museum? And it's like, okay, well, what's the museum? The museum is a relatively modern invention. So how do we keep reimagining the museum, democratizing it without censoring it? How do we keep, work that has edge and is biting, which obviously the moment is demanding. It's not needing sort of saccharine kids' playgrounds at the moment. I mean, obviously, my kids are desperate to get back to the playground, so I'm not going to be so radical that I discount playgrounds from the future.
Once they reopen, we'll see.
Oh. Exactly.
But your work is so multi-layered. I suppose you have lots of different ways in which you can interpret some of the complex theories that you are looking at. But also with something like Veals in Brussels, I suppose I'm trying to imagine what we're going to see. So you showed us some paintings that were on the floor in your studio.
In a way, that's me. Yeah, that's me being tricky because I'm showing you some paintings, and you're not just going to get some paintings with me. I'm never that polite or kind of tidy. Like this lockdown beard, it's not very tidy.
Oh, I like it.
Thank you. Very kind. I like it too. It's great. I haven't shaved in weeks. It's wonderful. What was I going to say? With Veals in Brussels, it's actually a continuation of the work I've been doing around Bangladeshi architect Muzarul Islam, which people might have seen at Frieze Live last year or at Dhaka Art Summit earlier this year, depending on where you're based. And he's such a fantastic. He's not just an architect. He was an activist, an educator, a thinker. And his work on looking beyond the sort of binaries of kind of Western modernism, was really kind of exciting for me to get into, and to think about it in terms of how we break some of the binary encodings we find ourselves really still trapped in. This moment feels like in some ways the last gasp of patriarchy and imperialism, which okay, let's tear down some more statues. And what was it?
You did a project with us at the University of Non-Dualism. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Islam and non-dualism and that idea generally.
So Islam was, very influenced by both Tagore and Marx, and but obviously there's a specter of Advaita philosophy in or I read a specter of Advaita philosophy. Maybe that's my artistic license, but and that's where non-dualism comes from. It's an ancient philosophical system that talks about that it's only when you're caught up in a materialist mindset that everything, drops into binary categories, or you need it to kind of, because that's all you can understand. And I think what we really need at the moment is complexity. And, I think, we all would, well, there seems to be a lot of opposition to complexity.
If things
it's
fit within
almost,
those binary categories, then people can't, it blows their mind. They can't possibly understand how anything has an existence or an identity if it's too complex. But I feel like,
exactly.
we're evolving, that's the better word, into being able to understand that. At least it feels like the next generation is evolving into being able to understand that complex existence.
Well, I think that goes back to my interest in the break. I think, every moment is a moment for radical reinvention. And that has to happen both on the material plane and the plane of consciousness. Because if we're not actually shifting consciousness, those things don't stay. Do you see what I mean? That's where, a lot of the criticism that's been coming out recently has been about corporates and others, very quickly jumping on a bandwagon that they were keeping themselves from, say, 5 years ago, or, in the case of L'Oreal or others. And it's like, how do we at this moment not make, that idea of ethics as fashion needs to be torpedoed, that ethics is intrinsic to the being, to the beingness of being human. And I think there's a need to kind of really make a groundswell shift so that certain categories don't come back into play. It's like, if there's a big enough groundswell, the world goes from being flat to round. And I think that's what we need. That's the challenge of the current moment. It requires, feet on the ground activism, but it also requires a big consciousness shift. So how do you enact those both simultaneously?
Yeah, and of course it comes down to really inherent systems that everyone's grown up with that we need to somehow try and break down and question and push. And I'm worried that, the institutions who are jumping on board, even brands who are jumping on board with Black Lives Matter movements are doing this because they say they are, and then it becomes a trend and then it's gone. And that's the kind of thing we have to continuously make sure people are embedding within everything they do. Which, luckily at the foundation, we are constantly able to and in a position to question, okay, well, what is this that we want to fund, and who's got the voice, who's going to be the one speaking at this, and who's going to be the person making this, and where is it going to be seen by people? How will it be, within which context is it being shown? So luckily we're in a privileged position to be able to do that. So thank you so much for sort of talking about all these issues with me today in the first interview we're doing, and hopefully we'll continue these kinds of conversations going forward. But I'm coming up on half an hour, so I am going to hit you with those Lifestyle Magazine questions. I hope you're ready.
Oh my!
So these are the questions that we put together because everyone at the foundation is dying to know, okay, what would an artist like Shezad Dawood recommend everybody has to see, read, or watch before they die, right? So this is a series of questions that we want to know the answers to. And I did send them in advance in case you wanted to take some time, but no, you felt like we're going to do this off the cuff. So let's start with that one. What book, film, music, or piece of work do you recommend everyone must see, read, watch, listen to before they die?
Oof. I think book, film, piece of music.
You can just pick one. You don't have a million.
Oh, well, no, I can share a million. You just have to, you guys might all have to hang on for another few hours. In terms of books, I've been, I posted on my own Instagram feed that how important Angela Davis was to me back as a young, angry young man trying to find something that I could relate to. And, if they come in the morning remains a sort of as important to me now as it did then. I think at this moment, Foucault's essay on heterotopia always comes back to me as a key touchstone to think about, how do we move beyond utopia? because utopia ain't working. You know, it's been around since Thomas More and before, and it ain't working. It's an
Yeah.
entrenched concept. How do we
Mm-hmm.
move into something heterotopic? And you know, I've been going back to think again. A lot of my interest in, like even the project at Veals around Musral Islam, I've been thinking a lot around the legacy of the non-aligned movement and alternate possibilities that we kind of missed along the way through, whether it was through forced regime change, like, you know, with Mossadegh in Iran. You know, what went wrong in the post-colonial moment? Or what opportunities were missed through outside interventionism, as well as, let's be honest, some internal corruption and other, you know, power grabs. So, you know, that period becomes, you know, constantly of interest because it reveals so much about the present moment. And I think in that way, I've been thinking again about all the interconnections you had at that moment, you know, whether it was from Angela Davis to Jean Genet to Huey Newton, you know, and how that continues into solidarity with the Palestinians at that moment. And, you know, how all of these solidarities could be regained. How do we regain a kind of broad-based solidarity? Because that's what's under threat at the moment. You know, in a way, there's been 20 years of complacency till Brexit and Trump, you know, which, you know, in a way are inherently covertly or you know, covertly or overtly, you know, white supremacist projects. So how do we think about a level of solidarity and, you know, internationalist movement building, but that doesn't just hark back to the 1970s and those moments, but reimagines it for what we need now? That's something that I've been thinking about. You know, for Veals, I'm thinking about Musral Islam in relation to Minette de Silva, the sort of pioneering Sri Lankan architect, and thinking about how we think through an idea of tropical modernism as a way also to respond to Spivak. You know, Gayatri Spivak's been back on my mind. A lot of things that I guess I first read 20 or more years ago are kind of back on my desk. You know, Spivak's The Subaltern Speaks. I'm thinking about how the subaltern does speak back, and at this moment, and what that entails, and how does the subaltern speak back, not from a position of a master-slave dynamic, but as a kind of active, palpable, vigorous subject, in terms of a disrupting possibility. You know, Genet's films are...
These are the kinds of things that are feeding into your Veals work, did you say? Some of these conversations, or is this the kind of next stage of your research?
No, even in Veals, weirdly, I'm thinking about, you know, a relationship between Musral Islam, Tagore, and ecology. So actually one of Musral Islam's unfinished projects, which is the whole, which is the basis for, I guess there's two parts to the Veals installation. One relating to Musral Islam, which is almost me sort of closing out, you know, a third project on him and really kind of engaging ever more deeply with his archive before kind of almost gently starting the research curve on Minette de Silva. You know, I'm a kind of slow food kind of artist, so these things cook for a long time. But with Musral Islam, I'm focusing for Veals on his incomplete project for a government housing block at Joypurhat in Bangladesh. And like a lot of the sort of incomplete work of earlier political moments that I was just talking about, one of the most amazing aspects of that project was never even realized, which was the master plan for the planting. So it's like these sort of maybe unspoken, unsung kind of songs or connections of a certain politics of the land that connects through to an ecology of flora. So he had his master plan for the planting of Joypurhat, which was based also in turn on Tagore's planting for Shantiniketan, which relates to native and non-native species and how they can speak to one another through a seasonal discourse. And, you know,
I think
kind of
this is starting to go over my head. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you can, is maybe send a snapshot of all these books that are on your desk, all these essays, these readings, or even just a list to me, so we can share it with everybody who's listening. So I'm scribbling down all these names and ideas, but there's so much, yeah, so much thought there that I'm not sure we'll be able to
Yeah.
get into the depths of it now.
Yeah.
If that's
Sorry,
okay,
but I guess
do that.
that's totally fine. I think the bit I'm most excited about for Reveals is working with tropical plant specialists to recreate some of the species that would have
Wow.
appeared in Chantinicatan in the installation.
Okay. Oh, that
And
sounds
so,
amazing.
yeah,
When
it's
does
going to
that
be
when does
quite,
that open?
sorry?
When does that open?
September, September the 10th at the last time we discussed it. I think this sort of state of flux might allow for some degree of of movement. I quite like this, that the opening might be then, but you might be late or you might be early.
Yeah, who knows? We might not even be able to go. That's the other problem we're working through here, I guess. But okay, one other question I wanted to ask, which is something that our trustee Al Bagri and I were really interested in. Generally, if you could go back in time to either your teens or your 20s,
Hmm.
or early years, would you live your life the same way, or would you make a different decision?
It's funny when that came up, I saw that was one of the first questions that popped out at me when you sent them through. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose, like most of us insecure, mildly neurotic human beings, I've spent most of my life thinking of all the mistakes I've made and how I wish I could have handled a particular moment, a breakup better, been more mature, been a better human being. But actually, it's funny, like maybe sitting here after a good 10 weeks of lockdown, I wouldn't do anything differently. It's all been essential to bring me where I am. Even the things I regret and that keep me up at night. I think that's it. I think that's the call of the present moment, is to sit with what makes us uncomfortable, to become, to sit with the awkwardness. All of us. Because unless we start to kind of work through our collective trauma, we're just going to reinflict it left, right, and center. So no, I'm happy. I'm happy with everything I've done and all the mistakes I've made.
Good. I seem to have frozen. I'm just
A nice spinny circle thing. Oh, you're back. Oh,
oh, good. We're back. Okay. So before we lose connection again, I would like to ask what
oops.
that
Oh, I've lost you, Chelsea. I don't know if it's
individuals
my end or your end, but you were freezing on me there.
are facing today. This is what happened last time. I guess the connection just starts to go after we're hitting up on 35 minutes. So I'll just ask a couple more and then we can wrap it up.
Right.
But what do you think is the biggest challenge that individuals are facing today? If you had to pick one particular thing that you would like to see individuals try and tackle, what would that be?
Well, typically, I'd never say it's just one thing because, as I've maintained through a lot of my career and work, it's interlinked. And I suppose then the challenge is, how do we understand these crises as intricately interlinked and holistically expand our sphere of consciousness to hold problems. That it's not just one fix over here. It's the whole fix. How do we stay? It's, I suppose maybe I'll quote Donna Haraway and say, staying with the trouble.
Staying with the trouble. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then one last thing, and this is the kind of question that spawned the series. What would you save if your house was on fire?
My kids and my wife.
Oh. But what if they save themselves? Is there nothing physically you would save that's a human being?
It's just, maybe this is a ridiculous thing to say for somebody who makes stuff, but it's just stuff. You can't take it with you. you know.
Okay, that's what you'd probably say. And I'm curious, the reason we want to ask this question of everyone, I think everybody eventually, this stuff doesn't matter, which is kind of ultimately, you know, an artist and making all these things. Ultimately, you can start again, right?
It's understanding the relative, you know, or it probably goes back to, you know, when you were asking me about Leviathan. I think it's our own relative importance in the larger ecosystem and the sphere of being, you know. Let's not take ourselves either so seriously or make ourselves so important or centric to the conversation. That's a key thing we need to kind of really work on, I think, for the next phase.
Yeah, that's some really good advice to end on, I think. And I just want to say thanks again for all the time that you've taken to go through this with me. We're desperate for your reading list, it seems. And I'll just do a quick shout out if anybody has any really urgent questions to send them through now on the comment so that we can see them before we cut off here. Let's see. No, just good comments and thumbs up. I'm liking this.
Yeah,
So,
thank you very much, everyone, for being part of it and all the lovely things I've been seeing in the corner of my screen. Thank you. It's appreciated.
Oh, really good. So I just want to let everyone know the next Open Up series will be on the 24th of June. Time, Instagram Live, hoping it stays together. And we'll be inviting Taiwanese artist Charwei Tsai, which I'm really excited by. So I hope to see you all then. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.